I really enjoy hearing because I think a lot about her, how knowledgeable she is in the Jewish history in the county. And Diane, pardon me? So, you know, we have, thank you, Beverly, relax. See, Perna, I've been Perna trained. Diane's a graduate of UCLA, professor, another one of your kindred spirits. And she has a master's degree in communicative disorders. And I was checking her out this morning when she was talking with Bob to see if everything was okay. Currently, she's completing a book of 25 biographies that include Justice Louis B. Brandeis. And I've always looked forward to Diane doing this for us. And thank you. So I'll turn it over to Diane.
First one on my fan club. Anyway, thank you, Beverly. Thank you very much, Ray, for agreeing to do this. I was twisted his arm and he gets involved in everything. So originally I thought, well, this is going to be called Jewish Pioneers of Ventura County. But I thought about it this morning and I decided to change it to, oh, thank you. Forgot about that. How's that? Jewish Pioneers of Ventura County, the musical. Okay. Now the reason I did this is because my friend Connie Kornstein, who does so many shows around Ventura County, and I were doing a show about Minnie Cohn and Lucy Levy, Baker Bay Levy. And so I decided that this would be a good time to put a booklet together to give everybody who attended it at Heritage Square in Oxnard. So this took me 4 months to do this, spending a lot of time and having a lot of dusty furniture. But I did interviews with children of the early pioneers. I went to every library, museum around town, including the one in Ventura. So I got a lot of information, and that's how I put this all together. And so I wanted to start out with, I'll start out with a little bit of background about all of this. Okay, I found that most people, and Rabbi Ralph Moses of blessed memory said the same thing, that most people do not realize that there were Jews here in the 19th century. They just thought it was 1960, 1970 with the influx of people to Thousand Oaks. But actually it started way earlier than that. Most of them came from Germany, some from France, some from Poland, some from Russia. And this talk is going to be divided into 3 parts. The 19th century, then the first half of the 20th century, and then of course the second half of the 20th century. And we're going to start out with, speaking of banks, Levy, Lucy Levy, Achille Levy, and also Simon and Minnie Cohn up in El Rio. Okay, so Achille Levy was born in France, 1853. Yeah. Well, when Germany annexed Alsace and things got really bad for the Jews, they left for the United States. And it's an interesting thing. I was thinking about it because so many of my relatives were poor. They came from little towns in Russia or Hungary, and they landed in Ellis Island and stayed in New York. But these people came straight to California because some of them actually had relatives in San Francisco, which was a booming town. It was 20 years after the gold discovery, and they had already built up businesses. So that's what happened with Achille. So Achille was pretty clever. He went to see his uncle in San Francisco, went to a business college for 2 years, and learned English, which they all had to do. So then he came to Port Hueneme, and he was busy as a merchant. Then he realized he needed to get a wife. So he went back to France. France. So he
A million comedians at
And
work.
he found someone
Wanted the rest of the
named
year.
Lucy Levy. She was a distant cousin, so she had the same last name. And he had some money, and he showed the parents that he had plenty of money. And the parents said, okay, and she was willing to leave Paris in her beautiful gowns and so forth and come to a little village named Port Hueneme. It was probably Hueneme at the time. So they did. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. So they crossed the ocean. Meanwhile, Achille is terrible, terrible seasickness. People asked her, how did you spend your honeymoon? She said, I was tending a sick husband all the way across. So they took the train from New York to Los Angeles, and from Los Angeles, they took, not quite like this, they took a stagecoach. Okay, this would have been perfectly okay, except this was February, and it was actually rain, and so the ground was all muddy. They went up the grade okay, but the driver was just afraid there would be an accident. So instead of everybody just staying in the stagecoach, they all had to get out and walked down the whole hill. Now here is, just imagine, here's Lucy in her beautiful Paris gown and her nice suede boots and got all muddy. And that was her introduction to Ventura County. So then things got worse. Things got worse because Jill said, you know, I have a nice little house in Hueneme. And so she said, oh, sure, this is great. It's just enough for the two of us. He said, I'm sorry, darling, but we have to have 4 people living with us because the workers had to stay someplace. So they also slept in bunk beds in that little house. So they were a little cramped at the beginning. Now, the other thing about Achille was, Achille became, he was a merchant, but he also worked with the farmers. And when they got their money, when the money came in and the crops were harvested, what did they do with the money that was left over? They gave it to Achille, and he hung on to it until the time that they needed it, like a little bank. Then he started his own bank. First he worked, you know, at the Bank of Hueneme, but then he opened his own bank. It's still there in Oxnard, you know, downtown Oxnard on Fifth Street. I was thinking of that too, that's so funny. And of course he became a very wealthy man, but he and his wife, Lucy, they were great big philanthropists, and they were very, very active in the community, doing so many wonderful things. He was also postmaster, and I want to just give you sort of a formula, the way it worked. Usually there were brothers, maybe 3 or 4 brothers. So the first one who came out to California would say, okay, Morris, you go to Somas, and this one goes here, and this one here, Santa Paula, Ventura, and you open up a store. And not only do you open up a store, like a mercantile store, but you are also the postmaster. So, but very, very, very important was you also opened up a saloon. So all these towns had to have a postmaster, post office, they had to have a mercantile store, and they had to have a saloon. So that's why I brought this. Now, at the same time all this was going on, like the 1870s, there was a man named Simon Cohn, C-O-H-N. Now Simon came to what was known as New Jerusalem. He did not name it that. It was a Protestant group who named it New Jerusalem. It was eventually changed to El Rio, and most of you know where El Rio is. In fact, where the, you know, that whole business center is, that was kind of the hub of El Rio. Now, he needed to find a wife. He was from Germany, I think Bavaria. So he goes back to Germany, and he finds a wife. And what is her name? Minnie Cohn, C-O-H-N. No relation. This was no relation. Brought her back, and he was very successful. He bought up some property. They were actually pretty clever entrepreneurs. And both of the Cohns and the Levys were very, very active in civic affairs, and also in the Jewish community as well. So, this one thing I forgot to mention. Ashiel had actually earned by 1881 $50,000. So I guess Lucy's parents were very impressed. Now at that time too, going back to Ashiel, lima beans were the big crop, but that petered out. And so the next crop was sugar beets, and you know all about the Oxnard brothers, from whom the Oxnard was named. They never lived there, they just had the big factory there. So now it was sugar beets, and that became the important crop. So another thing I want to mention about Lucy, not only were they big philanthropists, and also very active in civic affairs, but she was also very involved in the county fair. So that county fair has been going on for a very, very long time. And so I brought this along as a testimonial to what has changed over the 100 years or so. Believe it or not, one of the categories for the fair was challah, egg bread. Who would have ever expected? So I entered my challah, and I got first prize. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the Cohens a little bit more. So here is Simon, who's doing very well. He has a wife. They're also very active in civic affairs and Jewish affairs. And they had families. I think they had 2 boys and a girl, and the Levys had 3 girls and a boy. Now, what they had to do is they had to find a way to get Jewish education. Different things happened. From San Francisco, they got a little study guide for the kids. The other thing they did, Ashiel was very, very friendly with the Episcopalian minister in town. So he said, let me know when you're going to be talking about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and I'll send the kids. So that's what they did. They got together at people's houses and so forth. Now I called one of the ladies who since passed away. Her father was one of the early settlers. And she said, people are not going to believe this. Not going to believe this. After they figured out that there just wasn't enough room in people's houses, they decided to find a place to hold services. The first one was a dairy. The second one was a Coca-Cola bottling plant. That the Coca-Cola company actually volunteered. They didn't have to pay for it. So she said, people are not going to believe this time. But it was true. And they had other places like that until way later when a synagogue was finally built, now Temple Beth Torah. Now, other people came to this area besides them, quite a few actually. And I'm going to just run off a few of them so you can see how amazing it was. Okay, just a little bit about the holidays again. Jewish families got together for holidays and life cycle events because there was no synagogue at the time. So they had to get the rabbis to come from Los Angeles all the way to Ventura County to conduct life cycle events, weddings, funerals, and so forth. One of the rabbis, Rabbi Blum, came from Los Angeles, Temple B'nai B'rith. But they decided to change the name because it was too much like the B'nai B'rith organization. And it is now Wilshire Boulevard Temple. Yeah, lots of fun. Incidentally, too, and you'll see in this book, those houses that the Levys moved to, they moved from Port Hueneme, they had 4 kids, they needed bigger quarters. The house is still there, it's beautiful. And then Lucy was very happy because her brother decided to come also to Oxnard. So he came from France also, and he built a house. So you've got these 2 beautiful homes that are still there. I think it's D and 2nd Street. Okay. Now, some of the philanthropic things that Lucy did, they founded the Jewish Orphans Home in Southern California, now Vista Del Mar. Some of you may know about that. And she joined the Red Cross. She contributed to the City of Hope, so that's been around for obviously a long time. And the National Jewish Hospital in Denver, and the Federation of Jewish Charities in Los Angeles. All right. I already told you about that. So I'm going to give you some of the names of some of the people who were here. The Lehman brothers, Morris Einstein and Abraham Bernheim. Both men were born in Königsberg, Germany. And actually, you know, the Guggenheim family, Henry Guggenheim also was affiliated with these two men. So you can read these yourself. You have the book. So there were a lot of people. Most of them owned shops. One of them sold shoes, one of them mercantile stores, all kinds of things. They even had a music teacher. And they had one doctor in the county. His name was Joseph Marx. So they had a Jewish doctor.
Thanks God.
Yes. Interesting, Dr. Marx was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, so he went way back. Not everybody came from Europe. Some of them were born in different states, like somebody was from Memphis, Tennessee, and other places in the United States. Give me a chance to turn the page. Now, the Levy family continued on. They ended up with 17 banks of A. Levy. And after Achille retired and passed away, his son Joe Levy took over. And after Joe Levy, Mr. Milligan, they called him, but he was a favorite grandson of Achille Levy. He took over the bank. It is, of course, not in existence anymore, but there are still people around who worked in that bank over the years. Now, Bud Milligan was in the Navy during World War II, and then after that he joined the Bank of A. Levy. And we know that there's Seabees here, and they just returned and just lived here. They were just here, you know, during, you know, as military, but then they stayed here permanently. Okay. Now I want to talk some more about holidays. Okay, and I mentioned about Los Angeles and how the rabbis had to come here. They finally established a Sunday school. And for that, I want to jump a little bit forward to Mr. Ride, Max Ride, who actually reigned in the family in the, 40s or so? 1940s? Max Ride. They were one of the early members of Temple Ventura and Ventura, the Ride family. And also the Cohn family raised uncle and aunt, Yolanda and Henry. So there were all these people who found it. And what was amazing about Max Ride, and I talked to his daughter Candy about him, he was called a mensch. He just went out of his way. He would drive all over Ventura County, all the way up to Carpinteria to pick up the kids so they could go to Sunday school. I read, I think, like 5 or 6 stops just to do that. He was a very nice man. Right, Ray? You remember him well. Now, I want to talk about something I find kind of amusing. There actually was an opera house in Oxnard. And what was kind of nice was, you would figure, who would stop in Oxnard? You know, I mean, you could just go right by. But when they came from Los Angeles, they needed to stop overnight. They figured, as long as we're here, why not have a show and make some more money? So they did before they headed for San Francisco. And you remember Houdini? He actually performed. He was Jewish. His name was Weiss. Last name was Weiss. And also Sarah Bernhardt also performed. Unfortunately, that opera house was burned down. I think it was arson. And Mrs. Simon Weinman, she started a Sunday school so the kids could have an education. And I mentioned about the opera house. And there's a picture, by the way, in the book of Sarah Bernhardt and also Houdini. Now I'm going to move up to settlers of the 20s through 40s. And these are the people you know, right? Because his cousin lived in, I think they moved to Camarillo in the 1940s. 46, right. So, now in the 1930s, and I thought this was pretty interesting, the population statistics were as follows. In the 1930s, Oxnard had 8,000 people. Camarillo, 1,500. Ventura, 10,000, of course, because they were a much older city. So I told you about Max Rye. Max Rye's brothers actually were here. One brother was here before he was. What happened was his brother Lou had tuberculosis consumption. And the doctor said, why don't you move out to California? You can die there, basically. So he came out to California and he didn't. He lived a lot longer than that. Nice weather we have here. Beats the East Coast. So anyway, so his brother Max came out. I already told you about Max. And as I mentioned before, each brother was, it was like the army. You go here, you go here, you go here, you go here. You open a mercantile store and a saloon and you're the postmaster. So Max Rye was very good friends with Adolfo Camarillo. Adolfo Camarillo became a vice president of the Bank of A. So those families were really pretty close. And Adolfo Camarillo willed his suit. He used to ride the white horses, as we know at parades, the Rose Parade and all that. And he willed his suit to Max Rive. Max Rive also had the key to the Catholic Church. It's now a historic monument. And he was given the keys because all they had was an itinerant priest, so he had to be in charge of that. So what did Max Rive do? He donated that suit eventually to the Camarillo Ranch. Is that what it's called? The Camarillo Ranch House. And if you haven't been there, that's a really nice place to go. And you'll see that suit there in his saddle. His saddle and that suit is still there. It's called, by the way, St. Mary Magdalene Catholic Church. Just a short walk from the store in downtown Camarillo. I love the story that his daughter told me. Kids would come inside sometimes in his store and steal things, and instead of having them arrested or yelling or screaming at them and charging them with this and that, he hired them. And they had to work in the store until they paid off the material that they stole. That was pretty cool. When Max went to Los Angeles, he would get kosher meat and bring it back. And they liked square dancing, he and his wife. Now, Candy told me that one night in 1948, the 4-year-old, she was sound asleep. All of a sudden, she's awakened. There's shouting and screaming, and she's wondering what's going on. Family and friends were rejoicing at news of the establishment of the State of Israel. Now we're going to talk about your aunt and uncle. 1946, his uncle, he was a blacksmith. You don't hear about blacksmiths anymore. They just throw things away and they buy something new. But he actually fixed things and he did iron work. So they moved to Camarillo. Henry was born in Croatia and his wife Yolanda in Hungary. Now the reason that they moved to Camarillo was because Uncle Henry was hired as a blacksmith for the hospital in Camarillo, the mental hospital, way before it became a university. And he wanted to do something for Temple Ben Torah. So what he did was he made a wrought iron menorah, and if you go there, it's attached to the front of the building. It's still there. And I said to his kids, Blanche and Sam, I said, nobody knows about this. You've got to have a plaque. So they had a plaque made up and put it on the wall next to the menorah. He was the last appointed blacksmith hired by the state of California. They lived really close to the Rives and they were really, really good friends with them. There was no high school this way. in Camarillo. So they were bused to Oxnard High School, and Sam remembers going to Oxnard High School. Bus driver was the math teacher who picked up the kids at farms at a central location. For fun, the kids went to picnics in Santa Barbara, or they went to McGrath State Beach. I don't even know if it's open right now.
Yes.
It is still open. It is, okay.
The campground is open. I don't know about the rest of it.
Oh, okay. Okay, I want to move on to the Moses family. Martin and Roselle Moses and their 2 sons, James and Ralph, lived in Berlin before World War II. Martin owned a shoe and a slipper store. The Nazi presence, however, prevented anyone from entering the store. Meanwhile, the relatives, and this is a relative of good old Minnie Cohn again, the son-in-law, whose name was George Zander, and his wife Hanchi, they called her Hanchi. By the way, these people are all buried in the Ivy Lawn Cemetery. I've been there to see them, that whole family. And so they arranged for the family to escape. They got out 2 months before Kristallnacht. They just made it in time. Now Ralph, one of the brothers grew up to be an optometrist, and he was also a cantor at Temple Beth Torah for a very, very long time. And if anybody knows him or has ever met him, he was just the very nicest person. Very beloved. Now his father, Martin, initially worked as a tailor in George Zander's store, but then he had his own store. Okay, some other local families. This is the 30s and the 40s. So, Bert and Jean Ornstein, by the way, his cousin Sam told me about these people. Irene High Richmond, daughter Judith Richmond, and the Polanskis. The Polanski married Ray's cousin, Blanche. Mr. Ornstein had a radio sales and repair shop, and they also carried televisions. All these people were very active in civic affairs. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Singer lived in Santa Paula, and the reason I wanted to include the Singers was their son became pretty well known. His name was Bob Singer, and he worked for Hanna-Barbera, doing all the animation and all kinds of other things. Now, another family, the Pavins, had a son named Corey Pavin. Corey Pavin became a very well-known professional golfer. Yeah. Okay, Candy had a grandmother who lived with the family. Her name was Anna. And she said one day, "Hey, you've got 10 men here. Start a minute. You have a million. Start a temple." She sounded like she was a forceful lady. You have a temple now. So, in the beginning, they just had Friday night services. And again, there's Max Wright in his car picking up all the people, the kids. And 16-year-old Sarel, who I just mentioned, passed away recently, was a volunteer services. And for high holidays, they had itinerant rabbis come. Of course, her mother, Ruth, made Rosh Hashanah dinner. And Sarel made sure to tell me that her favorite, most well-known dish was brisket. My mother's too. So more and more families were moving to Camarillo, but Candy said she was the only Jewish child in her elementary school. They started a youth group. They had enough kids to start a youth group. And then finally in 1938, the VCJC, Ventura County Jewish Council, was established, and Temple Beth Torah was built on that same site. So that was the first synagogue in Ventura County. And as I mentioned, I love to say this again because it just gets me. It's so funny. Sarah told me that they initially met in a dairy, in Coca-Cola Bottling Company, I mentioned, corner of Seward and Thompson. We all know where that is. And Oddfellows Hall on East Main Street. I don't know. Not sure about that. I have to go check that out. Candy Rive Hutman recalled that many important aspects of life were celebrated at Temple Ventura. Her parents' 50th wedding anniversary, grandson's Pinyon Event redemption ceremony was held in the old synagogue. In the beginning, Dr. Ralph Moses officiated its services. Now, during World War II, the Jewish community volunteered at the USO so that the people who were volunteering that could have their Christmas dinner. And they did that every year. Now, the first service held at Temple Beth Torah, which is undergoing at this moment a great deal of renovation, a lot, was in 1960, and the first holiday celebrated there was Sukkot. And the women of the sisterhood went to the Camarillo State Hospital to give religious services, foods and gifts to the Jewish patients. In fact, my daughter, who's a co-founder of mostly kosher klezmer group, they actually went over to the prison, and everybody's welcome, everybody likes to come, Jewish women. And they give a concert just about every year there for the people who are in the prison. And coincidentally, I had my little summer over at the hospital, not because I was mentally ill, but I was there for a whole summer doing my 4th clinic, Lisa, over there. And the reason I picked it, we lived in Woodland Hills, and that was a lot easier to get to. And of course, it's no longer. And there were quite a few people who shouldn't have been there. You know, adults who had Down syndrome shouldn't have been there. So it was good to some extent that these people actually went to a more appropriate.
So the bars and all those numbers were made by that
I don't know, but I remember there were locks, and they locked you, and they locked you in, then they locked you out. And I had 4 clients where they had to have somebody with me. And in fact, I had somebody try to punch me one day. He was running, he had grounds privileges, and he's running across the grass, and I'm standing with a bunch of people. But luckily, I had my, I had a clipboard with me, and I just put it up, and he lost his grounds privileges after that. Okay, I'm going to move on to myself. It was 1946, and my parents decided to move to California from the Bronx. And how about East Side, West Side? Next. You want to do East Side, West Side? You have to do it in honor of anybody from Brooklyn, Bronx, New York. Brooklyn. Brooklyn.
New York.
New York, New York, that's right. Anybody know the song? You can sing along. The tots sang linger round rosy London bridges falling down. Boys and girls together, me and Willie O'Rourke. We get I took tap dancing. That's it. New York. So I still have. So I got a transfer card from PS 48 where I went to school, and it says Ventura on it, but it wasn't really Ventura because we moved to Newberry Park. I don't even think it was called Newberry Park. And I went to a 2-room schoolhouse that's still there. Thank goodness they kept trying to tear it down, but it now has, what do you call it when you get that? Special status. Historical landmark, thank you. Temple Grove days, reading and writing and arithmetic, on to the tune of a hick. Nobody hit me. I had a nice teacher. Well, it took me 13 years to find that school, but I finally found it. I thought it was the Conejo School, but it was the Timber School. And it's right off Newberry Road, you know, there. And I looked at it and went, oh my gosh, I haven't been to the school in like 70 years, and I somehow remembered it. Yeah, it was really nice. The only thing, my parents never took pictures of it or me there, but She did keep a note from my teacher, and it said, Diane reads very nicely. Okay. Now, I'm going to move on to close to the present. 1960s, 1970s, and we know I had friends who moved from the Valley to Thousand Oaks. And there's a picture of me here, and you have it in your book, my brother, when we first moved here. And Johnny Weissmuller. I have a special story about Johnny Weissmuller. All that was there, let me tell you, I remember 1946 pretty well. And there was nothing in Thousand Oaks. It was barren, pretty much. And there was jungle land, and there was a few markets, and there really wasn't too much else there. Very low population. 2 years later, we had moved to Los Angeles, and we decided to go to Catalina, which is a favorite thing for people to do, get in the boat. Who is on that boat but Johnny Weissmuller? I have pictures of me with him, and I'm eating an ice cream cone. I could care less. I didn't know who the heck he was. So I put some pictures in there of that as well. Now, by the year 2000, the Jewish community alone in Ventura County had increased to 53,000 people. Now, recall that the entire population of Ventura County was about 9,000 in 1890. So the Jews in Conejo Valley had carpooled to Ventura to go to the Temple of Beth Torah, but now they have 2 synagogues in Thousand Oaks, 1 in Camarillo, and I've listed them in the back of this book. There are Chabads in every community as well. In the 1960s, at first, before they had their own synagogues, they held religious school classes in the waiting room of a local physician, presumably on Sundays, I guess, and a member's garage, so you made do. Okay, by 1967, Thousand Oaks had 20,000 people, a huge increase from 20 years earlier, when we lived there and the population was 2,000. So just in 20 years, it's amazing. Okay, and I've mentioned about all those synagogues. This is the last part here. The Jewish community today, mentioned 53,000 Jews, and now, as Cantor Ralph Moses pointed out, we're no longer just a group of merchants, doctors, lawyers, teachers, musicians, and every possible profession that you could imagine. Murray Rosenbluth was mayor of Port Hueneme. That's right. And I mentioned about the sole doctor, Dr. Joshua Marks. Now we have so many Jewish doctors, we don't even count them. Actually, none of my doctors are Jewish, but it's so interesting because our cardiologist and our primary care physician were both born in Oxnard, Dr. Nishimori and Dr. Lopez, who was called a brainiac. They went to medical school, they came back to their community, which I thought was really cool. And you know what I'd like you to play for me now to finish up, honey? Okay? Catch up. Actually, it was his idea. that he play that to finish the program, I thought it's perfect because we are all so rich to be living in this wonderful county. Anybody have any questions about, yes? Oh, okay. I'm a docent in Heritage Square along with Kay Brainerd over here, and we give tours there, and they also have other events, so I suggest you check out their website, Heritage Square. And also, we just formed a group, Connie and I, co-founders, called Heritage Harmony Players. And people asked us, what is your name? We didn't have a name. We were just people who got together from Heritage Square. So now we're the Heritage Harmony Players. So you can also look it up and see what events we're going to have. I think Connie has written like 10 shows, something like that, and I've written 2. So there's lots of opportunities for things like that. And then the costume. I got this from somebody who retired as a docent. And I just so happen to have this skirt. I ordered some things. And I've also made some costumes and altered some things from a thrift store.
Well, tell them that you're also able to give these same presentations at their groups and all
Right.
the ones that they would kind of do.
Connie's been out of town, so I wanted a list of the, yes, we can do different shows. There's at least a dozen of them or so, any place.
Can you tell us a little information about the sewing machine Singer family?
I don't really know anything, do you?
No.
I'm just curious because I'm from Pasadena and
Oh,
I have
yes.
a stake there.
Oh,
So were they Jewish or not?
you know, I really don't know. I should look that up.
Okay.
I never thought about it. No, it's something of interest. It's the same name. I don't know.
Yes. Yes, you mentioned the CDs. There seems to be one of the best kept secrets of American military history. The fellow who founded the CDs and said, hey, we need to have military construction crews that don't get chased off in invasion, was actually Jewish.
Really?
And yeah, if you look up and you Google Jewish generals and admirals, his name comes up. But I suspect during World War II, broadcasting that you were Jewish was not a great way to promote your military career in the officer corps, especially in the Navy.
Yes.
And so he and like Admiral Dreller kept a very low profile.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that while the Seabees were founded by a Jew in the military, he wasn't at all mentioned in this. He wasn't active enough in the community.
You're talking about Ben Morale.
Yes.
Oh, no.
If you,
Is that so they named the
Yeah.
seat?
if you Google, which I turned my phone off to be polite.
Yeah,
If you Google, there's a website that has Jews in the military. I'm retired in the Air Force Reserve, so and his name comes up. Yeah, 2 or 3 others. 3. So like David Rose, the 2-star general who, from the armor who was captured and killed by the Germans.
Okay, good. I didn't know that. I'll check it out soon or something.
I mean,
One little fact I didn't know.
they don't have any exhibit.
One other little fact I didn't mention about Thomas Bart, he was friends also with the ladies too. And he was a senator, and he could appoint someone to West Point, and he appointed a man named George Patton.
Oh my God.
Wasn't he the only senator from this area ever?
yes.
I think
He was appointed by, that's when they didn't elect him, they appointed him.
I wanted to be, actually I trained to be a docent over at the Bard Mansion, which is really neat, except that the military changed their rules, and so that it isn't going to happen anymore. Connie and I are going to do that. You know, they're just for security. Yes. Yes.
What was the question? Related to General Electric that came from upstate New York.
Oh, really?
And, the whole city of Schenectady is still.
And my father was born in Peekskill. Wow. Yeah, exactly.
You don't hear that about that. So on in.
Yeah. you know, well, history is a strange thing, the way they write it, so many people should be are left out. I just will mention one more person who's not connected to this area, but it's good to know. Her name was Ernestine Louise Rose. She was born in Poland. Father was a rabbi. She was supposed to be marrying somebody who was as old as her father, and she didn't want to, and she was 16, and she left home. And somehow she had a little bit of money from her mother's inheritance. And she ended up throughout Europe and England, where she met her husband, came to the United States, and she was for women's votes, women's rights, and also she was an abolitionist. She was familiar with all the famous abolitionists, you know, like Frederick Douglass and who else? Wendell Phillips and so forth. But she's kind of pretty much written out of history books because at the end of their lives, when they weren't well and their friends gave them money for passage, they went back to England somehow. But if you look her up, she's an interesting person. Yes.
In your research in the area, did you discover evidence of anti-Semitism?
No, I really didn't. Not in the 19th century. Everybody got along. In fact, I'm glad you asked that question because the French, and we know that from Heritage Square, didn't matter what religion you are. If you were from France, you had your own little group. If you were from Germany, you had your own little group. They had their own little cliques, you know, little groups because they had the same culture and the same language. No.
Based on where you came from, not where you were.
It was where you came from. That's right. And there weren't that, I mean, there were more Jews than we thought there were, but there weren't that many compared to the rest of the population. I didn't. Nothing. Right, you didn't either, did you? And what you know, nothing. No. Well, thank you very much. Great.